So the first step of the challenge is, how do we capture the essence of the strategy that exists in this narrative form, often written in a way to help communicate to stakeholders and to motivate employees, rather than being the framework for strategy execution? So best practices in this area are the Balanced Scorecard. And the idea of the Balanced Scorecard, when we did our initial research in the late 80s, was we needed a broader way to measure how organizations perform than just looking at the financial performance. And this is particularly the case in the public sector, where the finances are a very poor indicator, in fact, of the value that you add to society. You see, most of the work that you do relates to intangible assets. You're helping out stakeholders, taxpayers, users of your programs, regulators, and so forth, in a way that doesn't relate nicely to finances. The joke I often tell here is, if we charge you more for this session, would you learn more? Of course, the answer is no. There's no relationship between the dollars you spend and intangible activities like learning. So our research indicated we needed 3 other ways to measure organizations. Customers, what do your customers or stakeholders want? Internal, what are your internal processes and how well are they performing? And finally, learning and growth. Now, at the time, we were working with Peter Senge at MIT, who'd just written a book called The Fifth Discipline. And learning and growth is intended to focus in on organizational learning and organizational growth. So that perspective includes competencies, culture, but also strategic assets. Now, the unique attribute of public sector organizations really fit into 2 categories. One is stakeholder complexity. The stakeholders that you have to deal with are a much more complex ecology in the private sector. In the private sector, we effectively have customers and shareholders. It's a bit more complicated than that, but that's it in essence. Whereas in the public sector, you have regulators, you have the employees, you have the users of the programs, you have the taxpayers, you have financial markets if you're posting bonds and so forth. And they all want different things from the organization. In Canada, the classic example is a hospital. I have the administrators, the physicians, the communities, the patients' families, the Ministry of Health. They all want very different things from that hospital entity. The other unique factor of public sector is the interdependency between organizations. Very few departments or public sector organizations can be successful by themselves. They have to work closely with other public sector groups or even the private sector in order to achieve success. Again, in the private sector, we would tend to buy up any asset we needed to help us be successful. So what we discovered after writing the book, using the icon that you see on the screen, we eventually began to realize there's a cause and effect relationship. In the public sector, your overall goal is to make your customers or stakeholders happy. To do that, you need the right internal processes. To have the right processes, we better have the right competencies, culture, and enabling structures, what I'll call the enablers. And then the foundation to all of this in the public sector is your financial budgets. So in theory, you can identify what you need to deliver to your stakeholders. Based on what you need to deliver, we should be able to sort out what are the internal processes you need to sustain your stakeholder requirements. Once I understand those internal processes, I can then determine what's a competency pool and capacity I need, what's a culture I need, and what are the enabling structures to build and maintain those internal processes to make your stakeholders happy. And then beneath that, of course, is the budget. What are the funds that we ask you to steward in aid of achieving those objectives? So those are the 4 perspectives and how we line them up into what we'll eventually call a strategy model that describes the strategic intent of the organization. Before we do that, though, I want to finish off the compare and contrast to the private sector. And this is important because much more research and authorship has occurred around the private sector, and I need you to be able to convert in your mind what you might read on a private sector article back to your world. So in the private sector, the topmost perspective is financial. right? For Tim Hortons, their goal is to achieve financial success for the owners and so forth. To do that, they have to make their customers happy. To make their customers happy, the right internal processes, and then the foundation of that are the enablers. So that's the private sector. For the public sector, it's pretty straightforward. All we really do is we take those three perspectives and move them up a level, and take the financial perspective and put it at the bottom. So the concepts are the same. The ideas of what the customers want in the private sector map roughly into what your stakeholders need in the public sector. Internal processes in the private sector, all the Six Sigma, lean, all the stuff we know about process performance maps nicely into the public sector exactly. Likewise with enablers. And on the financial side, there's a marginal difference where in the private sector we're trying to achieve financial success, whereas typically in the public sector we're just trying to be great financial stewards.